One of the important things that distinguishes the rule of law from the brute exercise of power is that the authority of law depends on consent, free of servility to its rule and, of course, to its punishments. And that means that the idea of a community under law, partly constituted as a community by the consent of its members to the rule of law, presupposes that its members understand the nature of law, its authority and its content to a reasonably sophisticated degree. They need to understand the concepts that identify the crimes, and they need to understand the distinction between the exercise of lawful authority and the exercise of brute or even subtly disguised power, mere power. And obviously that can lead to problems in a multicultural community, and even more obviously in the international community, to the extent that such a community exists. Law, we believe, must be universal in its reach, and if it is so legitimately, then it must express its understanding of crimes, especially the crimes, if we're dealing with international law, especially the crimes that we call crimes against humanity and the crimes of war, in ways that can, at least in principle, be understood by all the peoples of the earth. Now, on the face of it, that places considerable burden on jurisprudence to render reasonably perspicuous to understanding the nature of international law, its authority, and, of course, the crimes that fall under it. I'm far from being an expert in legal philosophy, but I have taken some interest in debates about the nature of genocide and in the relatively recent arguments, when I say relatively recent arguments over the last 7 or 8 years, about whether we should, in certain circumstances, legally permit torture. So I hope that what I have to say this evening is of some use to people interested in international law. The debate about the nature of genocide has been particularly interesting and relevant to my theme this evening. Two discussions of genocide run side by side, but they seldom engage with one another. The first is between philosophers, social scientists, historians, and political theorists. Its participants take seriously the question, must there be mass murder if there's to be genocide? For the participants in the second discussion, mostly lawyers, that question has lapsed almost entirely. The 1948 Convention for the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that's the name of the convention, is the legal instrument that for 60 years has told us what crime genocide is. The International Criminal Court has adopted it and defined genocide for international criminal tribunals that were trying suspects from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And according to the convention, and it should be noted to Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide in 1943, genocide can occur without a single killing in service to a genocidal intent. Participants in that first discussion, philosophers, political theorists, historians, and social scientists, know, of course, what the Convention says on the matter. They wonder, nonetheless, whether the understanding of genocide that it expresses is adequate to the experiences that made humankind feel the need for such a concept in the first place. Lawyers, to be sure, also have reservations about the adequacy of the Convention. Most often, however, their reservations are about its limited application. Some would like to increase the number of groups to include gays, people suffering from disabilities, and political groups, for example. But of course, proposals to revise the Convention prompt the question, what will determine what's rightly called genocide? Almost everybody agrees that the term is badly misused. And what I find interesting when lawyers, philosophers, political theorists, and historians meet to discuss the nature of genocide is the condescending incredulity that lawyers often show at the suggestion that the concept's application should be constrained by its adequacy to a morally overwhelming political experience of events that occurred more than 60 years ago, but which many people think we have not yet fully understood. And at least two things are at issue here. First, what counts as an adequate concept of genocide? And secondly, and this will be my topic this evening, what kind of thinking will deliver that concept to us? What kind of thinking will determine for us what we count as adequate here? What kind of thinking will enable us fully to understand the experience that made the Holocaust our paradigm of genocide and made Churchill speak of a crime without a name? Though Raphael Lemkin had coined the name genocide as early as 1943 and given an account of it in his famous work Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, it was Nuremberg, the European successor trials and the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 that gave us our deepest understanding of it. The Holocaust became our paradigm, and because it's such a striking one, no other crime is so identified with the 20th century. Despite Lemkin's groundbreaking work, were it not for the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, in Armenia and Rwanda, for example, might have been seen as no different in kind from the crime of mass murder, whose frequency and scale was also marked in that century, but which is, of course, as old as political association. After the Holocaust, many people were overwhelmed by a sense that they were confronted with a new crime, which humanity needed to bring into the space of a common understanding, even if, as some people suspected, aspects of it would always defeat attempts fully to do so. Some people took the need for a new concept to mean that the crimes that fell under it had probably not been committed before. Others believed that though the crimes were old, our moral response to them was new, in ways that required us to bring them under a new concept. Well, you will, I'm sure, be aware that there's been much and sometimes very bitter controversy over whether art, novels, poetry, film, for example, can take us to an understanding of anything important about the Holocaust. And though I'll discuss later aspects of Bernhard Schlink's novel, The Reader, I won't engage directly with that question. I want, though, to explore a very closely related one. On the face of it, our understanding of the death camps would be poorer without the writings of Primo Levi. Essential, though, to the understanding that Levi gives us is, I believe, the literary quality of his writing. In my judgment, it's writing that shows up Elie Wiesel, even his most famous book, Night, as given too often to sentimentality and even to posturing. Now, I don't ask you to agree with that judgment about Wiesel. I know that many of you won't, and indeed some of you might even be offended by it. But I ask you to consider whether it's intrinsic to the kind of understanding that writers like Levi and Wiesel give us that we need to make judgments of that kind. And I ask you to consider whether it's essential to the kind of understanding they give us, that is, people like Wiesel and Levi, that we need to judge whether we're moved by them only because we're prone to sentimentality or to pathos, or because we have a tin ear sometimes for irony, and so on. Why does that matter? Because I think if we do believe it necessary to make such judgments, then I think we also believe that the kind of understanding that writers like Levi and Wiesel give us, the kind of cognitive content they deliver to us, can't be separated from its form, broadly speaking, that I'll just call style. But of course you'll be aware of a contrary position, and one that dominates science and philosophy, including legal philosophy, that is, jurisprudence. And that position states that it's reason, often with a big R, that delivers the goods to understanding, and that reason aspires to operate, ideally, in a style-free, tone-free zone. Just as it makes no sense to ask whether a proposition in mathematics or in physics is sentimental or riddled with pathos or betrays deafness to irony, so, on this conception, ideally, it should be so with the deliverances of reason, especially in metaphysics. So, at any rate, many philosophers have believed since at least the time of Socrates. In Plato's great dialogue Gorgias, whose first section distinguishes philosophy from oratory, Socrates, many commentators tell us, says that orators appeal to emotion, whereas philosophy appeals to reason. Socrates, these same commentators say, taught us to be suspicious of what moves us because it is, at the very best, merely a psychological vehicle that acquaints us with a proposition whose cognitive character, whose character as a form of understanding, can be specified independently of the fact that we have been moved, independently, indeed, of the fact that we are creatures who can be moved. You'll recognise this, I hope, as a thought that's dominated a very important part of our Western philosophical tradition and our intellectual tradition more generally. Immanuel Kant, whose moral influence is easily detected in many of the preambles to international law, is a magnificent example of a philosopher who believes, by the way, I didn't mean magnificent in a derogatory way, I really mean magnificent. A magnificent example of a philosopher who believes that at least that when we think about the great matters of morality and politics, the cognitive content of one's thought, that content that's strictly answerable to reason and to truth, should always be, in principle, extractable from the literary form of its presentation. Art may delight us, but if it's to teach us, if it's to show us how the world is, then, this thought continues, we must extract plain cognitive content from form that often beguiles, dazzles, and seduces. And obviously this conception of things sets philosophy and art radically apart from one another. And in much of my writing, I've developed reasons, or tried to develop reasons, for believing that the separation emaciates both art and philosophy. And my argument has not been that the discursive thought characteristic of philosophy should be more attentive or more respectful to art, although I believe that, but it's been a more radical thought, that when we reflect on our critical responses to art and to life, and when, for example, we reflect on whether we've been moved by something in art or in life, only because we've succumbed to a disposition to pathos or to sentimentality, then when we reflect on that, reflection can yield a richer conception of the very nature, can yield a richer conception of the varieties of discursive thought. Reason, I think, is a word with which to make mischief, to cause intellectual confusion. There's a case for saying that there's no such thing. Less provocatively, perhaps, there's a case for saying that it can be only the name for a capacity to think well or badly. But there's not one way of thinking well or badly, because what it is to do it will be different according to what one's thinking about, whether one's thinking about literature or about physics, for example. Our efforts at lucidity will be defined by concepts, I call them critical concepts, that tell us for this or that realm of thought and reflection what it is to think well or badly, and therefore for this or that realm of thought and reflection what, to put it as Socrates so often did, what it is to be legitimately persuaded to believe something. And something similar, I would say, is true of rationality. It's an indispensable intellectual virtue, but one with limited application. Or I should say more precisely, the concept has limited application. When one tries to be lucid about one's morality or mortality, or one's vulnerability to misfortune, for example, to achieve what we call an understanding of the heart rather than just of the head, one must, of course, try to be rational. I take that for granted. That's just indispensable. One must also, however, avoid sentimentality, or, as I said before, a disposition to pathos, and so on. One must avoid these as forms of the false that in this kind of case constantly betray one's effort to be lucid, as much as being irrational would. This richer conception of what lucidity or efforts at lucidity require is not so much a richer conception of rationality, but rather one that marks the limits of the natural application of the concept of rationality. One can, of course, insist, as philosophers are sometimes inclined to, that anything that counts as an effort to see things as they are, as an effort to overcome sentimentality, for example, is an exercise of rationality now more richly conceived. But that I find as unhelpful as saying that when we try to see things as they are, we are always trying to see what is the fact of the matter, albeit according to an enriched conception of the factual. Both these tendencies rest on a perhaps natural, but on reflection, I think, a highly dubious assumption that to overcome sentimentality, pathos and so on is to eliminate them as causes of cognitive failure, of errors, of muddle. And to explain why that's an assumption about which I think you should be sceptical, I'll try to say something about what it meant for me to be truthful in the writing of Romulus, my father, a book that some of you might have read. At the time, writing about things that affected me profoundly, my mother's suicide and my father's madness, for example, I had to resist as much as possible all dispositions to pathos or to sentimentality to which such a subject matter makes one very much inclined. And that's not merely a personal remark. Anybody in similar circumstances should do the same. But in resisting these, I wasn't trying to get feeling out of the writing. I don't think anybody who's read Romulus, my father, would say that it lacks feeling. I was trying to make that feeling true. But I don't mean by that I wanted to be sincere. Sentimentality is sincere more often than not. In resisting sentimentality, I wasn't so much trying to feel right, but trying to see things right, to understand things right. And I can find no better way of putting this than to say I was trying to see things as they were, rather than how, succumbing to various common human failings, they were constantly appearing to me. And what else are efforts to see things as they are, rather than as they appear because one wishes them to appear thus, or because one's perspective is limited, or because one's judgment is distorted by, for example, vanity or sentimentality, or because one is tone deaf to irony, and so on. What else is it, if not to make an effort towards truth? I think it's a mistake, however, to think of dispositions to sentimentality or to pathos, for example, as only psychological states that sometimes merely disable proper cognitive function. Instead, I've suggested before, I suggest we think of these as not so much as causes of error or model, but sometimes as forms of falsehood. Whether I succeeded in portraying the people I wrote about as they were, rather than as for many reasons I wished them to appear to me, is of course for readers to judge. But I'm certain that in trying to do that, I wasn't engaged in an enterprise that is, of its very nature, intrinsically, rather than merely on account of common human failings, entirely illusory. Concepts like sentimentality, pathos, and so on, I've suggested, are critical concepts. They're concepts to which understanding, not just feeling, is answerable. And they mark out, I believe, a distinctive realm of understanding with notions of truth, truthfulness, and objectivity appropriate to them. And one should not, I think, assimilate the many ways we speak of truth and objectivity. We shouldn't too easily assimilate the many ways we speak of these to one paradigm of truth, perhaps factual truth, or metaphysical truth, or scientific truth. As concepts that mark forms rather than causes of the false, sentimentality, pathos, and so on define a distinctive realm of understanding, and one, as I said, that is interdependent with notions of truth, truthfulness, and objectivity. And I have in my writings called it, and I'll call it here, a realm of meaning. And when it's a form of the false, vulnerability to sentimentality is not a contingent obstacle to lucidity. It's intrinsic to the very content of our thought, and in such a case that we must make efforts to overcome sentimentality if we're to see things as they are, is intrinsic to our understanding of the concept, things being as they are in this domain. Or to put it another way, when sentimentality is a form of the false, then that we are creatures vulnerable to sentimentality is intrinsic to the cognitive character of the thought. And note I say here the thought, not the feeling. Intrinsic to the cognitive character of the thought that's being judged to be sentimental. And I'll try now to reveal the importance to jurisprudence of what I've just been saying about what I call the realm of meaning, the realm of understanding and thought that's defined by the fact that when we think about what matters most to us in life, our thought is answerable to our vulnerability to sentimentality, to pathos and so on, as forms rather than as causes of the false. And first I'll discuss the idea of dignity with a big D that features so importantly in the preambles to international law. And then, after that, via a discussion of Schlink's novel, The Reader, I'll return to a discussion of genocide and how I think we should try to understand it. Dignity, with an implied capital D, is an expression that occurs often in preambles to international law and in defences of that law, most recently in defences of the absolute prohibition of torture, as that's expressed perhaps most forcefully in the Convention Against Torture and Forms of Cruel and Degrading Treatment. And so too is the expression inalienable dignity, or the expression inherent dignity. And these preambles are, as I said earlier, often influenced by Kant, to my mind the greatest moral philosopher after Plato. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 speaks in the preamble of the, quote, inherent dignity of all members of the human family, and of the, quote, dignity and worth of the human person. In Article 1, the Declaration proclaims all human beings should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The preamble, common to both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1976 and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights echoes the Universal Declaration in speaking of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. The preamble then states, quote, these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. And the Convention Against Torture speaks in much the same way. And indeed everybody that I read who tried to defend the absolute prohibition against torture did so by appeal to this concept of dignity. The dignity to which such ways of speaking refers is obviously not the dignity that people seek to retain when they ask to die with dignity, spared the humiliations that attend some illnesses. That dignity is obviously alienable because it depends essentially upon a person's demeanour in the face of suffering. The connection between dignity and a person's demeanour can, of course, carry over to a situation in which a person no longer has a demeanour, when he's dead or in a coma, for example, and in which we're concerned that nothing should be done that would, in the ordinary circumstances of living, constitute a humiliation for him. For example, if he's in a coma, covering his genitals and so on. But if that is so, why has the concept of inherent dignity, the concept of dignity qualified in a way that appears designed to enable its application to prescind from the demeanours associated with ordinary alienable dignity, why has this way of speaking become so appealing to us? Well, part of the answer, I think, is that because appeals to inherent or inalienable dignity are often invoked when a person has lost or is threatened with the loss of all visible dignity, those concepts, inalienable dignity, inherent dignity, and so on, appear to keep that person who's lost all visible dignity in the same conceptual moral space as the concept that marks what he's lost. For these concepts, it's very important to note, are expressions in the key of the noble or the heroic. And that being so, it's easy to see why they're often deployed in struggles against oppression, especially oppression which is premised on, as racial oppression is, on disdain and sometimes contempt for the oppressed. It's also easy to see why it's such a well-suited partner for the idea of inalienable right, for that too is a concept in the key of the heroic. I don't need your pity, I don't need your charity. I'm standing on my rights. That's the thought. And for that reason, people often speak of dignity that's inherent in every human being, or of inalienable dignity to which we owe, as Kant put it, not esteem, but respect that is unconditional, in the way that, of course, esteem can't be unconditional. Well, I call these expressions like inherent dignity, inalienable dignity, the unconditional respect that's owed to it, or to take another expression from Kant, the expression persons as ends in themselves. I call these expressions in the middle ground, or for short, middle terms. On the one side of them, there are ways of speaking which are steeped in a sense of the importance to our moral and political thought of our humanity and of different forms of human fellowship, as when we speak, for example, of a common humanity, or say that to do such and such would be to treat somebody as less than fully human, or when we speak of the human family, or when, in political context, we speak, as in the preambles to the human rights laws that I quoted, of the brotherhood or the sisterhood, and so on. These are ways of speaking whose resonances and tones derive from the richness of natural language and the art made possible by it, language that's shaped by and shapes the lives of peoples. And the use of those expressions and a reflection on their use is necessarily in medias res, in the midst of things, because it's in the realm of meaning. The middle terms mingle well with those ways of speaking, that is to say, expressions like inalienable dignity mingle well with expressions like the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the family of man, and so on, or family of human beings. They mingle well with those ways of speaking, and that draw so obviously on the importance of the concept of the human to our moral thought, as is evident in those preambles that I read to you before. But not only do those middle terms mingle well with those expressions, there's a reason to think that the fact that they mingle so well is a significant part of the reason they've acquired their power for us.